On May 12, 1945, in a muddy trench deep in the Burmese jungle, 3 Gurkha riflemen crouched in total darkness as the sound of at least 200 Japanese soldiers crept through the undergrowth toward them. And at the very front of the entire British defensive line sat Rifleman Lachiman Gurung, 27 years old and just 4 feet 11 inches tall, gripping his Lee Enfield rifle and knowing that if his position fell, the Japanese would roll up the flank and slaughter 2 surrounded Gurkha companies behind him. And at 1:20 in the morning, the attack began as grenades started falling, the first arcing out of the darkness and landing just outside his trench, Gurung instantly scooping it up and throwing it back, the blast briefly lighting the jungle and revealing dozens of enemy soldiers charging his position. Another grenade dropping inside the trench and being hurled back again to explode in midair. And then a third grenade landing at his feet, Gurung reaching down to grab it, only for it to explode in his hand, tearing off the fingers of his right hand, sending shrapnel into his face and destroying his right eye, burning his arm, chest, and legs, and wounding the 2 Gurkhas beside him, as 200 Japanese soldiers charged straight at the trench, screaming, firing, and throwing more grenades, leaving Gurung bleeding, half blind, and missing most of his hand. And by every rule of warfare, this should have been the end. But instead, Lachiman Gurung seized his rifle with his left hand and started killing, firing, reloading, firing again, one-handed, shouting challenges into the darkness for the enemy to come and fight a Gurkha, holding that trench alone for the next 4 hours until dawn finally broke and the Japanese retreated, leaving 31 enemy bodies piled in front of his position, 31 soldiers killed by 1 wounded man with 1 hand, a man who by every expectation should have died in the first minute of combat. And this moment began far from Burma in December 1917 in a tiny mountain village in Nepal called Dakhani, where Gurung was born into poverty, where life meant hard labor and few choices, where young men either farmed like their fathers or joined the British Indian Army as Gurkhas, legendary soldiers feared across the empire, disciplined, fearless, armed with the curved kukri knife and guided by a simple motto, better to die than be a coward. And although Gurung dreamed of joining, he stood too short to qualify under normal rules. But in 1940, as World War II expanded and Britain desperately needed soldiers, the height requirements were quietly relaxed, and Gurung was accepted at 23 years old into the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, trained in jungle warfare, taught the Gurkha code of aggression in attack, stubbornness in defense, never surrender and never retreat unless ordered. Sent into Burma, where monsoon rains, malaria, dysentery, and the Imperial Japanese Army killed without mercy, where surrender was disgrace and capture meant torture. And by 1945, as Japanese forces collapsed and tried to break out south, Gurung's battalion was ordered to block their escape near the village of Tongda, digging defensive positions in soaked jungle terrain, with Gurung's section assigned to the most dangerous forward post of all, a trench 100 yards ahead of the main line, meant to warn, delay, and die, where he deepened the trench, stacked sandbags, laid out ammunition, and placed his kukri knife within arm's reach, knowing that if the enemy reached the parapet, he would need it. And when the attack finally came that night, Lachiman Gurung proved that courage doesn't require 2 hands. It only requires the refusal to quit, a stand that earned him the Victoria Cross and became one of the greatest one-man defenses in World War II history.
On the night of May 12th, the Japanese finally came, not as a probe or a patrol, but as a full-scale assault. At least 200 soldiers crashing into C Company's position with grenades, machine guns, rifles, and screaming charges meant to shatter nerves and punch a hole through the perimeter. And the entire weight of that attack was focused on one weak point, one section, one trench, Lachiman Gurung's position, the key to the whole defensive line. And at 1:20 in the morning, just after Naik Deba Singh Buddha had ordered his men to stand to, Japanese soldiers crept close under cover of darkness, and the grenades began falling, Buddha watching from a trench a few yards behind as the first grenade landed near Gurung's post, seeing Gurung snatch it up and throw it back, the blast lighting the jungle and revealing dozens of Japanese soldiers rushing forward, then another grenade dropping inside the trench, thrown out again to explode in mid-air as the attackers closed in, screaming and firing. And then a third grenade arcing through the dark and landing directly at Gurung's feet. Gurung bending to grab it, only for it to detonate in his hand, the explosion tearing off his fingers, mangling his palm, shrapnel ripping into his face and destroying his right eye, burns covering his arm, chest, and face, fragments slamming into his legs and hurling him backward in a spray of blood. The other 2 Gurkhas in the trench wounded by the same blast, all 3 men hit while 200 Japanese soldiers were seconds away from overrunning the position. And any other soldier would have pulled back, sought help, obeyed every instinct, screaming to survive. But Gurung didn't retreat or hesitate. Instead, grabbing his Lee Enfield with his left hand, even though it was designed for right-handed use, even though the bolt action required the right hand that no longer worked, improvising in real time by bracing the rifle against his hip, cycling the bolt with his left hand, aiming with his one remaining eye, and opening fire at the shadows rushing through the jungle. And the Japanese who expected to find dead or dying defenders instead ran straight into accurate rifle fire from a Gurkha who refused to die, killing the lead attackers, screaming challenges in Gurkhali, daring them to come and fight. The shock of it freezing the assault just long enough for him to kill more men and throw confusion through the Japanese ranks, forcing them to adjust as more grenades fell into and around the trench, Gurung no longer able to throw them back, pressing himself against the dirt walls, absorbing more shrapnel and burns, and still firing, cutting down rush after rush as bodies piled up in front of his position, turning the dead into obstacles for the living, while Naik Buddha watched in disbelief, having seen combat and courage before, but never a man so badly wounded fighting with the effectiveness of an entire squad. Attempts to reinforce Gurung failing because Japanese fire was too intense to cross the open ground, leaving 1 man, 1 eye, 1 hand holding the line against overwhelming odds, cycling a 9-pound rifle one-handed while bleeding from dozens of wounds, half-blind, in agony that should have caused shock or unconsciousness, but staying upright through sheer will because his mission was simple and absolute. Hold the trench, stop the Japanese, protect his brothers. And the attackers couldn't understand it, outnumbering him 50 to 1, attacking the weakest point with surprise and momentum, yet being stopped cold by a single wounded Gurkha. Officers trying again and again to push forward, only to be met by rifle fire, dead men, and a voice screaming defiance from the darkness. The Japanese attempting to flank the trench, only for Gurung to shift his fire and cover every approach, the jungle forcing them through narrow killing zones he dominated. The battlefield lit only by brief flashes of explosions as he fired at sounds, muzzle flashes, and shadows he could barely see. Moving within the trench so his muzzle flash never stayed in one place, Japanese bullets ripping into the earth where they guessed he was, while his shots found their targets. Time dissolving into a non-stop roar of gunfire, explosions, and screams as one wounded man fought like something beyond human.
Gurung fired until his rifle ran dry, then reloaded with his left hand, a task designed for 2 hands and meant to take seconds, but one-handed in the dark it took longer, and every second spent reloading was a second the Japanese could surge closer. So he adapted, fumbling cartridges by feel, forcing them into the magazine, slamming the bolt, getting back into the fight and firing again, repeating the cycle over and over through the night as grenades kept falling, some exploding close enough to tear more shrapnel into his body, adding pain to wounds that were already unbearable, blood loss draining his strength, shock blurring his vision, his body screaming to shut down. But the Japanese were still attacking, and stopping meant death for the men behind him, which was unacceptable, so he kept firing, round after round, knowing ammunition was becoming critical because he had started the night with only 60 rounds total, and every shot now had to be perfect, enough to keep the enemy back, but not so many that he ran dry before dawn. A brutal calculation he made instinctively as he fired until empty, reloaded, and fired again. And around 3 in the morning the attack intensified into a coordinated push as Japanese officers rallied their men for one last effort, charging from multiple angles with grenades, machine gun fire, and sheer numbers, willing to die to break through the single trench that had humiliated them for over an hour. But Gurung met them the same way he met everything else, with controlled, accurate rifle fire, operating on pure training as his left hand cycled the bolt, his one eye tracked movement, and his rifle spoke.
struck again and again, cutting down attackers until the assault shattered against his position like waves against rock, and by 4 in the morning the momentum was gone. Officers unable to force another charge, too many bodies piled in front of that trench, too much fear of the unseen defender who would not die, forcing the Japanese to pull back and regroup, still superior in numbers but unable to use them because advancing meant entering Gurung's killing zone. And during the brief lull he took stock, barely conscious, his right hand useless, his right eye destroyed, shrapnel and burns covering his body, cartridges running low, but evacuation and survival never crossed his mind as he watched the darkness and waited, rifle ready, while behind him C Company held its line, hearing the fight but unable to reach him because Japanese fire controlled the ground. Reports passing back that one badly wounded rifleman was still holding the forward post alone, something the company commander could barely believe until he listened to the steady, precise rhythm of single rifle shots still coming from that trench, still fighting, still holding. And as dawn approached, the Japanese made one final desperate assault, knowing daylight would expose them to aircraft and artillery, charging again with everything they had, convinced numbers would finally overwhelm him, and Gurung met them with his last rounds, firing until the rifle was empty, then reaching for his kukri knife, ready to fight one-handed, half-blind, bleeding out, to the last breath if they reached him, because better to die than be a coward. But the final charge broke short of the trench as attackers fell and survivors fled back into the jungle. And when dawn rose on May 13th, Gurkhas rushed forward expecting to find him dead, only to discover Lachiman Gurung still alive, slumped in his trench amid empty shell casings, rifle in his lap, kukri within reach, shattered hand, destroyed eye, blood everywhere, still conscious, still watching the jungle. And as they pulled him out and treated his wounds, it became clear the damage was catastrophic. His right hand lost, his right eye gone, his body torn apart by shrapnel and burns. But his trench had held. The Japanese breakthrough had failed, and an entire defensive perimeter had survived because one rifleman refused to stop fighting.
His right eye was permanently blind, shrapnel was cut from his body, burns were treated, and although Lachiman Gurung survived, he would never be the same. And while he was being evacuated, other Gurkhas carefully examined the ground around his trench, and what they found stunned even seasoned soldiers. 31 dead Japanese lay within a few yards of his position, 31 confirmed kills, all shot by one man with one hand in 4 hours of continuous combat, with blood trails showing where wounded attackers had been dragged away and scattered equipment proving there had been many more casualties than the dead left behind. And it was clear that Gurung had single-handedly stopped an assault by at least 200 soldiers. So the recommendation for the Victoria Cross was immediate, with Naik Debasing Bura submitting a detailed eyewitness report endorsed by the company commander and sent up the chain of command as an undeniable example of heroism. One man holding an impossible position against overwhelming odds, fighting on despite catastrophic wounds, never retreating, never surrendering, saving his entire company through sheer will and discipline. And the Victoria Cross citation was officially published in the London Gazette on August 9, 1945, just days before the war ended, stating that Rifleman Lachiman Gurung manned the most forward post of his platoon, bore the brunt of an attack by at least 200 Japanese, hurled back grenades until one exploded in his right hand, blowing off his fingers and severely wounding him, and that although his comrades were wounded and he was alone, he calmly loaded and fired his rifle with his left hand for 4 hours at point-blank range, killing 31 enemy soldiers with one arm. Though even that citation failed to capture the full reality of what he endured. 4 hours of non-stop combat while bleeding, half-blind, in agony, operating a bolt-action rifle one-handed, in total darkness, against an enemy that outnumbered him 50-1, with no support and no escape, driven only by duty and the Gurkha code, better to die than be a coward. And Gurung spent the end of the war in military hospitals, never returning to combat, later going home to Nepal, missing an eye and a hand, but carrying the Victoria Cross, one of only 13 Gurkhas ever to receive it. And life afterward was not easy, as farming with one hand was nearly impossible, and the pension was small. Yet he married, raised a family, and became a national symbol of Gurkha courage, known as the one-handed Gurkha who stopped an army, respected by all who met him.
and 50 years later in 1995 he was invited to London, honored by Queen Elizabeth II, welcomed at the Imperial War Museum, where people asked how he did it, and his answer never changed. "I was a Gurkha. I did my duty." And in his later years he spoke for Gurkha veterans, reminding Britain that soldiers from Nepal had served faithfully for generations. And when he died on December 12, 2010, at the age of 92, his death was mourned across Nepal and Britain, his Victoria Cross preserved, his story retold as one of the greatest one-man stands in history, taught to new Gurkha recruits, displayed in the Gurkha Museum in Winchester, and remembered not because he was superhuman, but because he was ordinary in every way except one: he refused to quit. And the Japanese soldiers who attacked him were not weak or cowardly. They were experienced, determined, victorious across Asia. But they met one Gurkha who would not move, would not break, would not die. And modern soldiers still study his action, searching for complex explanations when the truth is simple. He had a job and he did it. And that is why the jungle reclaimed the battlefield, but never reclaimed the story. 31 dead, 4 hours of hell, 1 hand, 1 eye, and 1 Gurkha who proved that better to die than be a coward was not a slogan, but a way of life. And on May 13, 1945, Lachiman Gurung showed the world what happens when a man simply refuses to quit. And if this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe for more forgotten World War II heroes, share your country and city in the comments, and tell us if you've heard stories of soldiers who fought against impossible odds, because men like Lachiman Gurung deserve to be remembered, not as myths, but as warriors who stood when retreat would have been easier.